Chain gangs also got the most demanding, backbreaking work. And then if that still wasn't enough to keep them in line, they'd get locked away in a prison when they weren't working. And if they were really unlucky, that prison would be the Sarah Island prison in Macquarie Bay in Van Diemen's Land, which is now known as Tasmania.
Wow, this is getting me.
This bay is surrounded by some of Australia's most difficult terrain. And if you know anything about Australia, you know that means it's a terrifying landscape.
Hey everybody, Larry Lawton here. Do I have a great video for you today? I have Disturbing Escape, the worst one from an Australian prison. And this is going to be a really good video. And I'm going to be reacting to this video, and that's what this is. And it's from Scary Interesting. I want to give them a lot of credit. They have 1,000 videos out there. They're a really good channel, and I love doing reactions to them because they do their homework. So we're going to jump right into this video. But before I start, please subscribe. Hit that like button. Hit that notification button. It does help, and I'd never really ask, so please just do that. I'd appreciate that. And to be honest, our reaction videos been getting taken down, been not pushed for a lot of reasons. So if you could share this video, if you like it. If you don't, you don't. If you like it, share it, please. It does help. All right, we're going to get right into it now because this is a good one.
In 1788, the British began sending prisoners to Australia to alleviate their overcrowded prisons and as part of their strategy to start colonizing the land. Many of these men were not charged with serious offenses, and so after their sentence would be released.
I tell everybody about that Australia was it started as a prison colony. Yes, and the British brought people over there. That's how actually Australia started.
Other prisoners would only continue to misbehave, and the worst of these would be sent to the remote and brutal prison colonies in Tasmania. And the worst of these colonies was the Sarah Island prison, where the conditions and punishments were truly horrific. So much so that prisoners would make frequent escape attempts. But unfortunately, those who were successful were then faced with the harsh reality of the wild and uninhabited Tasmanian outback. And the things they had to do to survive here were perhaps more horrific than the prison itself. As always, viewer discretion is advised.
You gotta love a video that starts viewer discretion advised. Obviously, this prison looks rough already. Time when people escape, but you know, it's not normal people to be incarcerated. It's not a natural act. It's not something you say, okay, I'm incarcerated. Especially if you have a long sentence and you say, my whole life's over. People then live till 60 years old, and now you're going to tell them you're going to get a 10 years, 20 years. Man, you know, that's not natural. Just letting you know.
There's a long-standing and mostly inaccurate joke that all Australians are descendants of criminals. And while it's true that the British sent many of its worst prisoners out that way, 80% of the people who immigrated to Australia in the 19th century went there by choice for a better life in a new land. Now with that...
Just learned something. I guess they sent prisoners there, but maybe it wasn't started as a prison colony. But that's where the British sent their people, and they wanted to... They said they wanted to colonize and take over that land or inhabit it. So,
said, that does still mean that 1 in 5 of the Europeans to set foot on Australian soil was a convicted criminal.
Close.
Transportation, as this practice was known, was basically just a step down from the death penalty. Even though these criminals were rarely sent away for the rest of their lives, the sentence meant being crammed into prison hulks, which were these massive floating prisons made from a decommissioned ship. And this was how they waited for a boat to come and take them away.
Wow. Never knew this. And you know, this is not new, people. There are other places like that who do that, who can do a prison like that, or on an island like Alcatraz or Rikers Island or something like that. They do things, a lot of places do things with prisons to put not only the barrier of the physical prison, but the barrier of the natural prison. Alcatraz, they're not even sure if the 3 guys who escaped there actually were alive because never been seen, never been heard from again. Now, that water in the San Francisco Bay is treacherous, not only sharks and currents and everything else, and it's not, some people say unswimmable. especially for a regular person. Same with this prison here I'm looking at. This looks like it's going to be a place tough to get away, natural habitat around it.
The conditions on these were dirty and overcrowded with very little food or water. Then once they were on board a proper ship on the way south, the living conditions weren't any better. And as they made the crossing, they also had the added risk of dying at sea. Many prisoners even passed from disease before ever making it to Australia.
That's big back then.
And once they got there, life in the prison colonies could be tough as well. During their time there were two classes of prisoners. The first were the new prisoners and well-behaved prisoners who were looked after quite well with enough food to keep them going and a little freedom. These individuals would be given jobs to do and they'd be given a suitable role if they were a specialist and skilled in some profession. Otherwise, they'd be given work as a laborer. They still wouldn't earn any money and lived as little more than an indentured servant working to pay off their crime. But other than that, the worst punishment would be the distance from their loved ones. For many, this was hardly any stress at all. Often, they'd even use the skills they learned to get paid work in Australia after being released, deciding to stay there and start a new life.
That happens more than people know. You know, a lot of times people leave prison, especially after a long sentence, and they have nowhere to go, which is home. Or they committed all their crimes in their home area, or they did a violent crime and they're not wanted in their home area. And a lot of people will settle pretty much where they are released. And that's the easiest way. A little bit now, after 2000, the year 2000, they're trying to make it where people can get back or they can go to a desired place. So that's a change. So they can give them a bus ticket and where maybe it's affordable. Maybe they have a bus route. Because if you were actually released in prison into this area, there's nowhere. Public transportation is terrible. And if you don't have money for a car, what are you going to do? You're going to be walking everywhere. And it's not too close. So that's why I understand that part.
Convicts behaved themselves, however. This was the second class. If the prisoners caused trouble, the first form of discipline was to have their rations restricted or they might be confined to a cell at night. If they kept making things difficult, they'd lose their job and be put in a chain gang, which is where their ankles would be attached to other prisoners by irons. They'd also have their diet restricted to just 1 1/4 pounds of bread and 4 ounces of oatmeal per day with a bit of sugar in it. Chain gangs also got the most demanding, back-breaking work. And then if that still wasn't enough to keep them in line, they'd get locked away in a prison when they weren't working. And if they were really unlucky, that prison would be the Sarah Island prison in Macquarie Bay in Van Diemen's Land, which is now known as Tasmania.
Wow, this is getting me.
This bay is surrounded by some of Australia's most difficult terrain. And if you know anything about Australia, you know that means it's a terrifying landscape. Escaping across it is nearly impossible.
I had no idea Australia's landscape was that treacherous to Tasmania and all the hills, mountains. It's crazy. I had no idea of that.
To the west is the ocean, and then to the east are uninhabited mountain ranges, cliffs, gorges, and rivers that no sensible person would try to cross. Not to mention the massive rainforest filled with dangerous animals. It's also cold in the bay compared to most of the rest of Australia. Powerful winds hit the coast so often with such force, the prison had to build a barrier wall 2 feet thick and 26 feet high to deflect them.
Wow!
In the winter, it also snows, and most of the rest of the time, it rains. The ground is also so wet that most early farmers in that part of Tasmania chose livestock over crops. The land was just too soaked through to grow much of anything. The only place where that wasn't the case was Phillips Island, which is another island in the bay with some shelter from the wind and rain, but it's also tiny. That meant that food at the prison was restricted, and the chain gang prisoners ate almost nothing. And if you still misbehaved after getting there, there were some special punishments unique to Sarah Island. A repeat offender might be sent to a rocky outcropping off the shore to sleep out in the open. To get onto the rocks, they'd have to climb up onto them, which meant getting wet. So then they'd have the choice of a damp sleep or taking their clothes off entirely and sleeping naked in the cold wind and rain. But even that is not the worst of it. The worst offenders were flogged using what was known as a double cat o' nine tails.
Wow.
It had 9 leather strands, similar to a normal whip, but they were twice as heavy as normal, with twice as many knots that were also double the usual size.
That is crazy. Being flogged, whipped. You know, that's the stuff we hear about the slaves. This is their own slave. I don't care what they say. Whoever puts people here, the British, you know. I don't know. You know, the British don't have a great name. The more I do research, you know, they were pretty brutal.
Getting flogged by one of these would put a person in the hospital for months. It
Hospital
shattered
for
ribs
months.
and caused severe internal bleeding, as well as deep cuts and lacerations. And afterwards, the wounds would be washed with salt water, adding to the agony.
Oh,
But surprisingly, it was as brutal as it was ineffective. Getting flogged usually made prisoners desperate instead of better behaved. In fact, reports from the time claim that people whipped once were more likely to get whipped again. Some of the prisoners even went on to commit crimes that would get them the death penalty, so they would never have to go through it again.
that's crazy. That's like you hear these people do something like that, and it's really weird. And I don't know what's weird, so I shouldn't say that. But here they are getting flogged, and some people went back for it when they have internal injuries and all this kind of crazy stuff. That's like me saying, hey, I want to go back to the hole and get abused. No, I don't. I'm not that crazy yet.
Others, like Alexander Pierce, would go on to plan their escape. All his life, Alexander Pierce couldn't seem to keep out of trouble. In 1819, when he was around 26, he was convicted of stealing 6 pairs of shoes and sentenced to be transported from his home in Ireland for
6 pairs of shoes. This is in Ireland. So this is back in the UK days, United Kingdom, you want to call it that. And here, 6 pairs of shoes for 7 years. Home in 7 years. Wow. You know, as much as I'm into the criminal justice reform, it boggles my mind to see what one human being will do to another human being. It really does.
7 years. It was probably not his first offense because the cost and time of transportation weren't usually used for something as simple as petty theft. So though there's no record, it's safe to assume Alex got into trouble most of his life. After sentencing, he spent 6 months in a hulk on the south side of Ireland. Then on October 3rd, 1819, he was packed onto a ship named the Castle Forbes with 140 other convicts heading to Port Jackson near Sydney, Australia. 166 days later, on January 27th, 1820, they reached Australia.
Remember, that's 6 months out at sea. 6 months. Listen, I'm a retired Coast Guard. I can tell you what that is. That on a ship like this, I can imagine just the bearing of the sickness and the disease that goes around the ship. No medical care, no food. Wow.
Australia and were promptly sent to Van Diemen's Land. Then finally on March 4th, he was disembarked and given his first work assignment. Alex didn't have a special trade though, so he was made a farm laborer in and around the Tasmanian island. This meant he had some freedom where he could work and be looked after, which should have been easy. But soon enough, Alex's behavior began to be a problem. Just 9 months into working with the farmer, he did his first stretch in a chain gang.
Reminds me of me. That's what's scary.
It's not clear what he did, but he was given another chance shortly after. He then worked as a servant to a local constable for his next job, but again, 16 weeks later, he was back in the chain gang. Then in December, so almost a year after arriving, he got a new job on a sheep farm. This was also where he made his first attempt at escaping with 4 other prisoners. They even managed to stay free for 3 months before being sent back to prison. Unfortunately,
3 months is pretty good, but you got to remember, this is 1820. There's no, America's Most Wanted or any of that stuff. This is where they get away. They can go to a town and nobody will ever know it again. I'd like to know, and maybe they're going to say how they got caught.
Getting captured seemed to only make Alex more eager to cause trouble. On May 18, 1821, he was given 50 lashes, confinement at night, and chain gang work for embezzling 2 turkeys and a duck. And he seemed to just continue this pattern.
Embezzling food. Wow.
Constantly going from easier jobs and then back to the chain gang. Eventually this escalated and Alex got involved in robberies and got arrested for being drunk and disorderly, stealing, and several other offenses. After which, in November of the same year, he was given 6 months in a chain gang. During this time as well, Alex had also been forging order forms to get a hold of items, maybe for trade or to use himself. In March of 1822, this fraud was discovered and he ran away with 6 other prisoners for a second time. He managed to stay free for another 4 months. When he was finally captured and convicted, he had all of his freedoms and privileges taken away. But worst of all, Alex had finally done enough to be sent to the opposite side of the island. You see, up until then, Alex had been landing himself back in the prison near Hobart, which is the most populated area. This time, he was taken to the remote and brutal Sarah Island prison, and he wouldn't be given another chance this time.
you got to be really sadistic in some way to be, you know. Listen, I was fighting the system, so I do understand why people do certain things, but it was always everything I always did was to protect my health and my money or whatever, or get money or whatever it is. It wasn't just to do it and hit with pain or something like that. That's wild.
At this point as well, he had 4 years left of his sentence. That would be 4 long years doing the most brutal, backbreaking work with very little food and the possibility of more lashes if he did something wrong. It looks like this possibility was too much for Alex to bear, because only a month later he would attempt to escape again. But this
attempting escapes and escaping to me is, you guys know how I feel, and if you don't, you will now. I think it's natural, and I said most, but there's a lot of countries who will not charge you if you try to escape. And they will charge you, don't get this, so if you look something up, they'll charge you for the damage, like if you break a window, or you break a door lock, or you do something like that, break bars, somehow break something, they'll charge you for that. But they're not going to charge you. The attempt of escape is just a natural act. That's what a lot of places are saying. And that's Germany, Norway, a lot of Swedish, that kind of area, you know. They're compassionate and they understand, and people start looking at things a little bit there. And that's not to say they're bleeding hearts, because they're putting you away. And you know what prison's about? It's losing your family, being away from loved ones, not having control. When they say get up, you got to get up, no matter what it is. A lot of things that a little you don't understand if you've never been to prison is what takes. It's not so much about them beating you, because that's not what you are sentenced to. You are sentenced to confinement, not beatings or death if that occurs. And it happens way too often.
This time, things got a lot nastier. On September 20th, 1822, after arriving at the prison, Alex was one of several chain gang prisoners sent to the eastern shore of the harbor for a work assignment. Luckily for him, prior to his arrival, some other prisoners had been planning an escape attempt. It's not clear if Alex landed in the group by chance or if he'd found a way to work his way in, but either way, the men behind the scheme, Robert Greenhill and Matthew Travers, had a long history. They'd known each other back in Ireland since before they were convicted, and they'd tried to escape once before by stealing a small boat. This time, the plan was to use the work assignment to escape. Their job would be to cut timber that would be sold in the local towns. That meant leaving the island and going to the mainland, having your irons removed so you could work safely, and each man would be given a potentially deadly weapon, which was an axe. Now, just as a warning, the details of what happened next come from 4 confessions, all probably but not definitely given by Alex. And although they don't wander too far from a single narrative, they do have crucial differences. Alex gave the first of these confessions shortly after.
This is wild. Alex is confessing, and they're saying 4 different ones. This is good. I'll tell you what, they do such good research on here. A couple little things I'd like to know, like how long were they out, or how did they get caught? But that could be a whole video, I guess. This is pretty wild, this prison stuff. And I'll tell you why. If people are fascinated with prisons, it's just what it is. And it's because you are fascinated with something that you don't want. Or you know, it's like on the edge, and you're not that kind of person. That's what that's about.
Being captured in 1822, and it's usually thought that he gave this confession to one of the local magistrates, Reverend Knopwood, who oversaw his trial. And this confession is a strange piece of writing, flipping from third person to first person and reading more like someone took an official statement about what happened and turned it into a confession they asked Alex to sign.
That could be.
According to this confession, on the way to their work assignment, as the boat got...
The confession thing, you know, listen, I'm a criminal, and I've been interrogated, and I know how they work. They couldn't do that to me. But back then, they could just fake paperwork. They could do anything. There's no recordings. There's nobody in the interrogation room. There's nobody else with you. There's so many ways to just... It was just, you know, the old Wild Wild West. Well, this is what it is. And I can tell you this, United States gets worse and worse.
Closer to the shore, the prisoners jumped out before the guard could stop them, ran toward a hut where the workers were stationed, and threatened them with their axes. Then they took all the food in the cabin, extinguished their fire so no one could signal back to the prison, sank one of these 2 boats, and then took the other down the river. When they reached as far as Phillips Island, they landed across from it on the mainland, smashed their boat, and then hid the pieces. The men then headed inland, each carrying whatever they could toward a mountain. They arrived at the base around 3 p.m. and climbed over 2,500 feet toward it. And from there, they could see the whole bay and the prison, and they wondered if the prison could also see them, so they kept hidden away in the brush. By the time they reached the top, it was late evening, so they lit fires and made themselves as comfortable as possible in the cold and damp weather. They also took turns keeping watch for any search parties while the others slept. In the morning, they carried on, trying to stay as high in the mountain ridges as possible. Then that evening, they stopped at a creek for water, ate some food, and made camp again for the night.
Man, they must
Day
feel
3
free
of the escape was when it became a struggle for all of them. The weather was just terrible with non-stop rain and freezing cold winds. These continued into the next day as they trudged through thick forest and occasionally crossed rivers, which soaked them even more than the constant rain. And when they could see ahead, it was foggy and difficult to figure out where they were going.
Wow.
On the plus side, Alex was sure they weren't being pursued anymore, which somewhat relieved the tension, but they were hungry and getting hungrier. That night, they found a barren hill, but at the top, they realized there were no trees ahead, just barren shrubland. That meant there was nothing to eat there. It was so empty, they couldn't even find so much as a lizard to catch and cook. They would eventually make camp for the night, and for the first time, some of the prisoners expressed that their decision to escape may have been a mistake. On day 5,
think of what that statement just said. You're out in the wilderness. You're free. Try to survive. Do whatever you're going to do. And you think, and you're in rough conditions, no question. But you're now questioning you escaping a prison where they beat you, put you in chain gangs. You're lucky if you'll live. I mean, they give you minuscule food, if any. Wow, that goes to show you how either hungry they got, because that's, survival, and, how the systems really are. And the systems know what they can do to hurt you or to affect your life. And it's amazing. They make you run and escape because our minds are always looking at the positive. They should be looking at the positive. Oh, I can escape and have a better life. I can do this. It doesn't come because there's nothing in your brain is going to say, nah, I'll stay here for life. This is the best way to live. I wouldn't. I sure wouldn't.
the rain kept coming down and was more torrential than ever, and they hardly got anywhere. Eventually, they found a spot with some shelter where they decided to camp for a while and hoped the weather would pass. On day 7, the rain settled and the fog lifted, and they could make out a mountain in the distance known as Frenchman's Cap. Reaching it meant they were about 19 miles from where they'd left the water. Then once they got to the mountains, the area wasn't as barren anymore, so they cut trees, built barriers from the wind, and started a fire. On day 8, the weather was better again, but the bush was so thick it made it almost impossible to make any progress. They decided the best way to keep going was to take turns going ahead with an axe to cut a path. While doing this, to keep tabs on each other, because they were spread out, they'd call out from time to time, but at some point, somehow, 3 of the prisoners disappeared. Rather than worry that they might have been left behind, the others were worried they'd given up and were instead on their way back to let the guards know where they were to try to get some leniency for their escape attempt. So rather than go back and look for them, they increased their speed through the dense bushes. On day 10, the rain came down hard again, and the remaining 4 men were desperate to find any sign of people. Despite the weather though, they crossed another set of mountains, then they found a river on day 11 and camped beside it overnight. The next day, the men who could swim helped.
Notice what they did there. They're camping next to a river. That's where you're going to get food and all that kind of stuff. I'm filming. No, nobody's in here. You did this.
Those who couldn't get over the river. By then as well, their shoes had worn out and walking was painful. They were also hungry, cold, and wet.
That's walking, guys, when your shoes wear out. I hear about like people who do the transcontinental walk from Mexico to Canada or something like that in the United States anyway, and they'll have to buy 3 pair of shoes, sneakers or whatever walking shoes they use. Wow, maybe I just never walked enough. I don't ever remember wearing out a pair of shoes. I really don't. That's amazing.
They began to slow down, managing only 4 or 5 miles on days 13 and 14. Then on day 15, they reached another larger river. Because they hadn't eaten for days, there was just no way they could cross. They didn't have the strength. This is when someone in the group had an idea. Alex claims, at least in this first confession, that the group came up with the idea together, but obviously someone must have suggested it first. What the group had decided was that it might be better to sacrifice one man so the others could survive by eating him. And apparently they were all so hungry and desperate that they decided this was a good idea. They then drew straws, and a man named Thomas Bodenham drew the short straw. According to Alex, he didn't panic or beg, he only asked to be allowed to pray and ask God for forgiveness for his crimes. Then they sent two of the group off to collect wood, knowing they wouldn't like what was about to happen. Alex claims that Robert then took his axe and struck Thomas on the head, instantly taking his life. And the reason Robert was chosen for this task was because, according to Alex, he was the only one of them who'd killed before. Then Robert took out his knife and removed the edible portions that the others cooked on the fire. And according to Alex once again, how easy all this seemed to be for Robert was unsettling and made the rest of them uncomfortable.
I've been around guys like that where they seem disconnected. They say they're a sociopath. They have no feelings or no empathy. They don't care. It's just, it's. I often wonder that if I was like that after robberies and stuff. I do. And I don't think I was, but you never know.
Either way, for the next 8 days, they continued making their way through the bush with their new source of food keeping them alive. But soon enough, this began to run out too. Eventually, they reached a valley with fern roots growing around a small stream, and one of the men, John Mathers, thought this might be a good food source. He scoured the valley for the youngest roots he could, managed to get a fire going, and then boiled some of the roots. After letting it simmer for a while, he ate some of it, and these turned out to be completely inedible, and John began to heave and then threw up everything he'd eaten. And then, according to Alex, Robert struck John in the head with his axe. This somehow wasn't a fatal blow, and John then managed to wrest the axe from Robert's hands. Incredibly, John restrained himself and instead of retaliating, only insisted that Robert shouldn't be allowed anywhere near the axe again, which was unanimously agreed to by the others.
Wow, this blows me away. This guy actually trusted this killer? I don't know about that one, man. I mean, just take his axe away, but he's behind me, he gets a vine, he gets a heavy rock. He tried to hit me in the head. I ended up maybe he grazed me or whatever happened, and I survived. Wow.
Later that day, John confided in Alex that he thought Robert and Matthew, given their prior history, would stick together and were just looking for the right moment to attack again, and that he and Alex should watch out for one another. Horrifyingly, 2 days later, maybe because he wanted to side himself with the strongest people in the group, a starving Alex decided that Robert and Matthew were the better chance of survival. One evening, one of the three of them pretended to be gathering wood and moved close to John. Then, before he could stop them, they pinned him to the ground, took the axe, and this time they were successful. Wow. Afterward, Robert found excuses to justify what—
Man, this is, you know, you often say, I can never do it. You don't know what you're going to do during starvation or desperate times. You really don't. You know, a very good friend of mine, one of my police mentors once told me, Larry, he goes, anybody or everybody is capable of crime. He says, if it meant me killing you to feed my family or they die, of course, taking out all the ways he would try to feed his family, he would kill you. And he's right. You would do what you have to do to protect your family and yourself, period. That's just what it is. It's called an instinct, survival instinct.
They'd done. He said they were probably close to a town, and he didn't think that John would have kept quiet about what had happened to Thomas. So not only did they have the strength to reach salvation thanks to the additional food, but they also saved themselves from the gallows. They all agreed with this sentiment, and with newfound strength they carried on, although Alex, admittedly, was still a little bit worried about Robert. 4 days after they'd taken John's life, a venomous snake bit Matthew in the leg while they were walking. They didn't immediately know it was venomous.
Did you see that, though? That wasn't a lot of days. I mean, you're talking 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 days. I mean, you know, you ever see these island people? Wow. You know, or the people on boats. Amazing. I guess some people can.
Until his leg swelled up, making it so painful to walk that he couldn't go any further. Matthew then told the others to go on without him because between the hunger and the worsening bite, he was sure his end was near. And he, like John, just wanted to pray and try to find forgiveness before he died, but Robert refused to go. Matthew was the only person Robert cared about, and he wasn't going to leave his friend to die. They would end up staying with him for 5 more days, and Robert did all he could. He fed him, brought him water, and tried to make him comfortable, but Matthew was in severe pain and his condition was worsening. Alex, on the other hand, partly because he thought Matthew had no chance of surviving, but mainly because the food they had was running out, wanted to end Matthew's life. But Robert wouldn't even entertain the idea. This wasn't just some convict he'd managed to escape with. This is a man he'd known all the way back in Ireland. On day 6 after he'd been bitten, Robert decided they'd try to keep going and just take Matthew with them. But if the walk had been difficult before, it was nearly impossible with the extra weight. Later that day, Matthew fell asleep while they were taking a moment to rest, and while he was out, Alex again brought up whether it was right to keep Matthew alive. While they discussed this, Matthew woke up for a second from the excruciating pain in his leg. He screamed out in agony for a moment and then fell unconscious again. And this was finally enough to convince Robert, and he could no longer leave his friend in that much pain. One of them then took the axe and finished him off.
Snake bites, this bites, anything, you cut yourself. There is no medication. And these guys don't seem like survivalists either, if you know what I mean. You talk about survivalists. I watch the shows, Naked and Afraid and all these crazy shows about survival. It's about survival. And obviously, you got to think of water, although they are fugitives. So that's in the back of their mind as well. It's not like they're surviving to get rescued. They're got to survive to move on and change their lives. So double-edged sword there.
Off. Afterward, as with the others, they made a fire and ate some of their new food and stayed in the spot for a couple days to regain their strength. 3 days later, they made their way up a ridge of some mountains to see if they could see any sign of people. They were sure there had to be some settlement somewhere, but they were wrong. There was nothing but more plains. It was just an endless expanse without a single town or road in sight. But then they spotted what they thought might be a path made by livestock. They went toward it, but unfortunately, when they got closer, it was clearly a natural formation in the landscape. Over this period of time, Alex was increasingly suspicious of Robert. With their food gone, it seemed like it might only be a matter of time. Because of this, at night, Alex positioned himself in such a way that if Robert came for him, he'd hear him coming. And it was a good job he did. Half asleep one night, he heard the axe being lifted off the ground. Alex then pretended to wake up and Robert backed off, but his intentions were abundantly clear. From that point on, Alex knew he had to get a hold of the axe. It was him or Robert. The problem was that Robert kept it close to him during the day and slept with it under his head at night, making it hard to get to.
He wants that weapon.
Eventually, one night, Alex managed to creep over and slowly slid the axe out from under his head before using it on him. Robert was finally dead and Alex was on his own.
Wow.
Alex then took some rations and continued his walk across the plains. Sometime between November 8th and 15th, so a minimum of 49 days since they escaped, Alex stumbled across a flock of sheep. By sheer luck, this was the farm of the shepherd he was taken in by while working as a laborer months ago. The shepherd didn't even recognize him at first. He was filthy, his beard was long, his clothes were torn so severely he was almost naked, and he was so thin he looked like a skeleton. But after a short confrontation, the man realized it was Alex and offered to help him.
Boy, when you lose weight, like I remember going from 260 to 200, and people said I look emancipated. Believe it or not, I know that's weird. At 5'9" and 205 pounds, I said I know. When I first got out of prison, I was actually 190 pounds, 188, 190, in buck shape, man. But a lot of people who knew me from the day said, "Man, you look emancipated, or you look like you're on crack or something." Obviously, I just got done working out like an animal, and did that every day. So, who knows?
After 5 days in his care, Alex thanked the shepherd and then, stocked with supplies, made his way down the road to another man he knew in the area. He'd built this man's hut 6 months earlier while still a prisoner. This man was part of a small enterprise, and he invited Alex to join him. Alex then spent the next 2 months working with him as a bushranger, which was really just a clever name for a sheep stealer. And then because of this, he was arrested on January 18th.
Sheep stealing. Listen, stealing and robberies and murders have been going on since if you want to believe it, Adam and Eve. But I don't know. This is crazy now. You have the brothers and Cain and Abel and all this kind of crazy stuff. That's in the Bible. I'm not a big guy in that. But It does help. And in this case, you're talking about total murders, robberies, sheep, forgery. They did everything. It's times just make things different. People always say, can you do crime now? Of course you can. You just got to be better at what you did. You just got to put it this way. When the system comes up with something, the other side, the bad guys, so to speak, come up with something to beat it, and then the system comes back and beats them. And it's a game, and it goes on and on and on, and it's called a cycle of life. It really is.
1823 near Jericho. By then, he'd been on the run for 113 days, and he made it almost the entire distance across the island. So that is the first version of the events. Alex's second version might not have even come from him. It's claimed he made this confession while he was in the prison hospital after he'd been captured and sent back. And he apparently told this story to one of the prison officials, and it was written in the prison's record books. Unfortunately, those are likely lost to time, so all we have are two slightly different sources, both of which come from minutes of a deposition given to the British House of Commons by an assistant surgeon who claims to have been there when Alex confessed. In this second story, Robert is the villain right from the beginning. In this version, a different man was the first to be killed after Robert suggested him because the man had supposedly volunteered to be one of the prisoner floggers. In this version as well, it was Robert who introduced the subject of cannibalism.
Oh. Did that get by everybody? Did that really get by everybody? Prisoner flogger. That means the system would make a prisoner whip or beat a guy half to death, internal bleeding, all that stuff you heard about, and it's a prisoner. Now they're saying he volunteered. I don't know if anybody heard all that. The prisoner flogger is bad enough. Now you volunteer for that? If that's true, bad.
He claimed he'd seen it done before and that it tasted like pork. Another key difference in this version is that Robert had no issue killing Matthew. It was even Robert who told Alex to do it. Now, whether this was a genuine confession or not, the author, whoever it was trying to put as much blame on Robert as possible. Then, a third confession supposedly took place while Alex was waiting to be executed.
These confessions are no good.
The jailkeeper was said to be the one who Alex told this new version of events. This time, it's less harsh on Robert again. Like in the original confession, the first death was a group decision. Straws were drawn, and Thomas was the first to go. But Matthew, not Robert, is the one who took his life. John was also killed after drawing straws, but he wasn't ambushed like in the original version.
It's amazing how history does what we're doing right now. History tells a story, and we were talking about this today. Also, the victors, in this case, the survivor, tells the story. So if you can get all these screwed up stories from only one person who knows the story by telling other stories, it goes from one person to one person, and it's a different story when you're done. It goes to show you, man, this is crazy. That's why I guess I like the law, and I'm skeptical of a lot of eyewitnesses and statements and stuff like that. There's motives behind a lot of things, guys, and that's not right for putting people in prison.
And like the second confession as well, Robert suggested Alex finish Matthew off to end his suffering. In this version, it seems more like a mercy killing than an act of evil. Either way, Alex confessed, or so it seems, a fourth and final time. This final confession was one that a reverend delivered to the crowd at Alex's execution.
Wow.
The reverend claimed he'd just gotten the version from Alex moments earlier, so Alex had no reason to lie. And during this, Alex also confessed to another crime. In this final version, Thomas was the first to die, but it was told as if he didn't have much choice. The group apparently ganged up on him, and after it was done, they were all forced to eat some so that none of them could claim to be innocent. And the rest of this confession is more or less similar to the first confession. The truth is probably somewhere in between, and especially difficult to discern given how long ago it was and the available information.
Absolutely.
However, the story isn't over, and this next part may change your mind about which version of the events you think is most likely. This is because it wasn't that first escape attempt that led Alex to the gallows. After being captured, Alex was sent back to Sarah Island to await trial, and he probably knew his chances of returning to Ireland anytime soon were low.
Probably.
Still, he settled back into his routine of working in the chain gangs. He had the same job as before, chopping wood on the mainland, but this time his ankle iron stayed firmly on and he was attached to another man. On November 13, 1823, he was sent to work on shore and chained to another man named Thomas. He usually shared his leg arm with Thomas, and despite being linked together, Thomas was eager for them to escape. According to Alex, Thomas knew he'd managed to escape once, so he constantly begged him to run away with him, but Alex refused. Then, when Thomas showed Alex he'd smuggled some fish hooks, a knife, and some burnt rags for lighting fires out of the jail, Alex decided it was time to make another attempt. When their guard was out of sight for a brief moment, the two ran for it, each carrying their axes. They then spent 3 days wandering around the area, reaching a river known as King's River on the 16th. At that point, they were roughly 10 miles from where they'd run. Soldiers were also out looking for them this time, so they waited for 3 days hiding in the woods. Then at some point, some sort of argument took place. They were hungry and hadn't made much ground, and the argument made Alex so angry that he decided to take Thomas's life. Then, once again, he ate his companion. As you might have noticed, this was becoming almost a habit. He stayed there for the rest of the day and that night before deciding to simply go back to turn himself in. This was his second.
Did you hear that? Again, the human mind boggles me. It really does. You would escape. This is after all that other stuff became a cannibalism. I guess he likes fucking pork. You know what I mean? Arm pork or ribs or whatever they... Amazing. But then you do all that and you go back in? Think of that. Crazy. You know they're going to kill you. You know they're going to execute you. Just kill yourself.
An escape from Sarah Island and his 4th escape attempt overall, and it would also be his last escape. Alex was convicted of the murder of Thomas and hanged at 9 a.m. on July 19, 1824. Afterward, he was taken away and dissected in the belief that they might find some physical reason for why he'd become a cannibal. His skull was eventually bought by an American phrenologist, Dr. Samuel George Morton, who was certain the lumps and bumps would explain why he did what he did. His skull is now at the Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology.
Oh, wow.
So after hearing everything, which version seems more likely? Was Alex hiding something deep within him that drew out a cannibalistic tendency, or was it just a coincidence? Was cannibalism just a means to survive on both occasions? I'd be curious to hear your thoughts down in the comments. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the form found in the description, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.
All right. I'll tell you what. Let me explain what I believe in this one. I don't think he's a cannibal per se, but cannibal. I think he would have did it a lot earlier in life. Well, maybe he did. Nobody knows. Again, you don't have forensics or any of that kind of stuff. But, you know, it seems in this case, they weren't getting fed anyway, anywhere. So even in the facilities, they weren't getting fed. Or out in the wilderness, they weren't getting fed because they didn't know how to do it. So he resorted to survival. So to me, that's survival, people. That is what it is. I'm not saying cannibalism. Do I believe one version or the other? Who knows? Really don't care. I don't mean that. What I meant is I love interesting stories. So I personally think there's no cannibalism, like, as that's why he did what he did. This guy was a troubled kid for his whole life, they said. And it seems like he was. And he is escaping, which is normal. But if he was escaping, he would just go to the nearest town and eat people or do something. Because you'd be known as a cannibal if you really were a cannibal from some other reason than survival. Or did he become a cannibal because of the survival? You let me know. I don't think he's a cannibal. I think he's a survivalist. Not a good one, but he did what he had to do. I don't know if you would. I don't know if I would. But I hope you like this stuff. I like reaction videos. Thank you again. Great video. So, and have a great day. Please stay safe. Make good choices.